Well, it looks like maybe we are or are not appearing. Yeah, let's see. Yes, we are. So this is the after party, folks. Having a few technical difficulties with the streaming software, but we can overcome any obstacles. This, of course, is No White Guilt, and with me is the Great Order. The crown winner of last week is Machiavelli Sucks. Financially gifting $25. Thank you so much, dear brother, and congratulations. In second place was Brad C. Financially gifting $20. Thank you and congratulations as well. Now, you can financially gift on Entropy at a cost of 15% to you, which will be up in a few moments, where you can also ask questions and you can vote on questions, and I never post any polls. You can also financially gift on Cash App. The URLs for both are in the description below. And as everyone knows, say it with me, Jared and I evenly share the financial gifts with our guests here on the After Party. Today, you could have seen it coming. The scintillating, incandescent mind of John Bruce Leonard is with us again here on Tap. John, please give the folks a brief introduction to yourself, and then Mr. George will take us into our conversation today.
Jason, thank you so much, as always, for a flattering introduction. My name is John Bruce Leonard, and I'm editor-in-chief of Arctos Media Limited, and I'm also a writer. I have a number of books on the market, a novel and a work of nonfiction. The novel is Thorntree, about the Faust legend, a contemporary retelling of the Faust legend. And then some of my work and poetry can be found on my website, johnbruceleonard.com, John bruceleonard.com. It's just my name. And apart from that, it's great to be on with you fellows again. It's always a pleasure, always an honor, gentlemen. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. Long time no see, my friend.
Indeed, Jared, indeed. Yes, you and I.
This is kind of emerging almost of the after party and learning in public, the show John and I have been doing since late August of last year as well. I'm going to put your link in the chat in a moment, but basically today, so John has been on, this makes his third time on the after party. We're celebrating his third time. So you're getting up there.
That's right. That's
with
right.
Some of our regulars. The first time was in July of 2019, and we were all just getting acquainted, and it was kind of a getting to know you as
Right.
we like to do in our first after party. And then last summer, I'm try to speak a little more loudly. My audio is a little low. I'm sorry, folks. I have a new mic. There was some mic troubles I heard feedback on last couple of weeks, and I guess it was because my old mic was breaking. What I use for singing too. So we'll have to figure something out.
Oh dear.
But at any rate, last summer when you appeared on the after party, it was very specifically about the COVID situation. It was very focused on that. So today, it's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge. I noticed that there were some questions all the way back from July of 2019, getting close to 2 years, your first appearance, that we never got to. And it seemed like there's just a thread of certain things we could look at that are current, certain things from the past that you're well versed in and studied in, and just kind of weave some interesting topics, ask some questions, see where the conversation goes, see if the chat has any questions. But I'll begin with this. One of the most interesting things to me that I wanted to ask you about when you first appeared that we didn't get to on tap with you, that I know is near and dear to you and all of us really, is how people are kind of being siloed into these different compartments in our modern discourse. And it's kind of breaking up this natural, healthy flow of conversation and debate that should be existing in a vital society in our ethnos, different expressions of our ethnos. So I just wanted to kind of put a broad question to you, starting there, and see what we can pick apart there. We talk about social signals. Obviously, we've all spoken with our friend Oliver about this a lot as well. There's a language to even the symbols of what you see in media. and what's around us in everyday life. But increasingly, I don't have to tell anyone that, the political situation we've all seen over the last several years, and obviously it has antecedents before that, has it's just been kind of separating people more and more, where they don't even feel like they speak the same language in a sense. So I was wondering if you had any opening thoughts on that.
Well, there's a lot to be said about that, and certainly should open us up to a good and rambling conversation, Jared, is our wont. So there are a lot of different places that one could begin with this question. I think that it's one of the great questions facing us, and we've talked about it, Jared, in numerous conversations that we've had. We've kind of touched on it more than really delved into it. I think that there are a number of facets here. Obviously, when the language begins to decompose to the point that you find break off almost languages, with break off jargons, break off dialects almost that emerge from a common source, that can be an indication of a general failure on the part of a culture to hold the center together. And I think that's definitely part of what we're seeing. We've seen this sort of dumbing down of our language to such a point that we've lost our ability to find the proper words to describe the concepts that confront us even on a day-to-day basis. And a natural consequence of this is that we have to go groping for new ones. In consequence, so people find new words, they invent new words in many cases, they find new expressions to talk about these things. Many of these terms are in a way superfluous, because one can certainly find alternatives, valid alternatives in our massive English lexicon. But since we've lost that, we need to go somewhere to find it. And that's, of course, is just a consequence of the dumbing down, particularly of America. But this is also a universal phenomenon. It's not limited to our country. It might be particularly acute in our country, because if you compare the political discourses or the public discourses of our contemporaries against those of even, say, 100 years ago, not to speak of 200 years ago, the tremendous and horrifying poverty of our language really comes home. So again, this might just be a consequence of us trying to reconstitute what has been deliberately eroded through any number of efforts, I think, really to work through the education in an effort to make people stupider than they really are by eliminating concepts within our language. This is exacerbated by other trends in our contemporary society, many of which are really aimed at substituting old concepts with new concepts in an effort to remake our worldview in a sense that is more applicable, more it's readier to accept the new world that is coming into existence around us. And Jason, this is where your work comes in. I mean, your work with the vocabulary, working with the vocabulary, which in many cases is simply attempting to, reacquire some of the old meanings of words. In many cases, it's almost a kind of, lexical warfare, as it were, an effort to really protect ourselves from the damage that's being done against us deliberately on the part of people who want to use the language in order to change the way we think. And that's an absolutely honorable endeavor. It's very, very necessary in our time. So that's part of it. We're playing a number of word games, as it were, but these are word games that are of essential and vital interest to us, because without the power of language to protect us, to allow us to understand ourselves and the world around us, we are absolutely defenseless when it comes to those individuals who really would like to prey on our inability to even articulate our idea of ourselves and of our societies, of our ethnos, of our race, our societies. All of these things play into it. So that's another element of it. I think at the profoundest level, I mean, there's more that could be said. There are other changes yet that have come upon us, but I think that at the profoundest level, what we're seeing here is part and parcel of the absence of a unified culture underneath us, something that is capable of sustaining us, a bedrock to which we can all turn. If we had a healthy underpinning, many of these changes would not have been possible, and consequently, many of the response to these changes would not have been necessary. It would not have been possible to eliminate certain words from our vocabulary. It would not have been possible to, as it were, blackwash, in the opposite of whitewash, blackwash certain words, ascribing to them a meaning that is not appropriate to them, that had nothing to do with them etymologically or in their past use, and transforming them into these kinds of moralistic monsters. It would not have been possible either to erode some of the finer words of our language that have really fallen into just a tremendous disuse, and another striking sign of the poverty of our souls. Words like nobility and virtue and honor and things of this sort that once constituted the common discourse of our peoples and now are practically non-existent in our day-to-day use unless we really apply ourselves to use them. So I mean, that lack of an underpinning, of a foundation, I think, is really the root source of all of this, and that's what really I think we have to be looking toward.
A few things immediately come to mind, but I'll start on the last thing you said about words like virtue and nobility. We've spoken about this before. You could easily think of people imagining those to be old-timey sounding words and or kind of lame, and they don't really mean anything. They're thrown around, which leads me to irony. What do you think the role of like everything being steeped in irony has been? What is that a symptom of?
Well, it's an interesting question, Jared, because irony is one of these words. It's one
Well,
of the words
yes,
that has been
that's true. Yes, yes.
taken, commandeered, transformed, manipulated, and made into something that it really isn't. Irony is one of the great facets of European discourse and has been since the time of Socrates, if not before. It is the ability to speak with a mind toward one's listener. It's connected deeply with rhetoric. It's also connected with the question, the problem of people who uh, think about things that are difficult from a societal point of view, and they want to be able to get to the bottom of really difficult and thorny questions, but they can't publicly declaim those views, and so they have to find a way around that. Well, this is something we're confronting in our own time. Irony could be a very useful tool for us in its original sense, insofar as it allows us to speak of things without speaking of them in such a way that we might become targets to an ever more observant and intense surveillance system that's kind of weaving its web around us. So, I mean, it's another example of this sort of a thing that's been stolen from us, because irony is something that should be our heritage as Europeans. It's part of our millennial history, and it's something that we can use in our contemporary day, if we understand it properly, to fight against the changes that are coming. But
Maybe a
instead, it's
better
been
maybe a better way to say it would be nihilistic language then today.
exactly, because that's what it's come to mean, right? It's used in the sense that you're ironic, you don't really believe in anything, you kind of laugh at things, you scoff at things. An ironic person is a scoffer nowadays. And
Yeah.
that is very, very, very nihilistic. And obviously, so far as that's concerned, I think that the only thing that one can say about it is that it is a symptom of the times. Anyone who believes that they're being original with that kind of just radically nihilistic perspective is badly mistaken. This is old hat and has been for at least 100 years. And the only difference about it is that now they can go around and publicly parade their nihilism. But the absence of any kind of a value that is of such a sacred nature that you are not willing to subject it to mockery or to scorn. I mean, that's not something to be proud of. And if you are proud of it, I think that's a sign of something perhaps wrong in a human soul, something that needs to be adjusted in some way. I don't know if
There's
that gets to
another
your question, Trevor.
Well, like I said, there's a few things going on. I thank you for making that important distinction because I fell into that just calling it irony like everyone else does. But you're absolutely right. I mean, yes, there are there's that sense of the sacred, but then at the same time, we are saying that people of European descent in the West has always been about inquiry and debate and analyzing and picking apart things. And I have to wonder sometimes where that line is and
Difficult
if we
line to
could
find.
put a finer and finer point on through the work that we do. I'm not saying we're gonna figure the whole thing out right here and now, but
Certainly we
the
are, Jared. We have what, another 45 minutes? We'll get it.
yeah. Well, we're ambitious if nothing else, but through these kinds of conversations we have and learning together as we all do, maybe it'll help us put a finer point on a healthy. Well, I think we've spoken about this too. It's when you can pick something apart. The best I can do right now, answering the question I'm posing, is constructing. You can pick something apart, but with an eye on making it better, constructing it, or making it foolproof against what could come against it, or what could harm it, versus that kind of just destroying for destruction's sake and that nihilism. I'm not saying there aren't finer points or nuances to explore there, but that I know now that I'm saying it, now I'm kind of piquing my own memory. I know that theme has come up with, again, I think all of us here I do want to just make another distinction quickly too, for anyone listening, that speaking about language, it doesn't mean that in the past everything was so prim and proper. I mean, there's pretty funny, outrageous examples of political debates right from the get-go in this country. I'm sure it was
Yes.
going on long before in the old continent as well. Of, you know, you'd have two guys running for office or something, and there'd be like just these wild claims about their personal lives. And so we're not saying that everything was, especially when, you know, talking about politicians vying for power. We're not saying that everything was all gentlemanly and refined. We're talking about something a little different here, though. As you said, the frame of people having the ability to understand the world around them without the constraints that we're given today, which leads me to this question. Another thing that some of your opening comments had me thinking about is, do we know how I mean, there are people who research this, of course, but to what extent can you speak to the way people spoke and wrote 100 years ago or maybe prior? What's been lost over the last century, even in more recent decades? And I know that you are a great lover of the English language itself. And of course, you're a writer, as you said in the beginning. We've spoken again about the English language itself at times. What is your sense of this devolution of it? Or do you have any examples that you can give listeners speaking to this, and how, kind of, what's been taken away from people?
Well, I think that the most obvious thing that one sees when one compares the two kinds of language is the extreme simplicity of our contemporary vocabulary and the extreme specificity and complexity of the past vocabulary. Um, the use of words has certainly undergone an extreme diminution in our time. The number of words that people use. Now, if it is the case that words are not simply superfluous adjuncts to a language, and you just keep building on and adding synonyms on synonyms on synonyms, as some people seem to believe, but if rather new words are introduced in order to express concepts, in order to express things that we find in the world around us or in our experience of the world, then a reduction of the number of words that we use amounts more or less exactly to a reduction in our ability to express ourselves and our ability to grasp the things of our experience and to express them in discourse and to understand them and to work our own way through our views of these things in conversation. It amounts as well, of course, to an impoverishment of conversation, which is something that we focus on a lot here in Learning in Public. So that's one of the things that one sees, and I think that that's an essential part of it. And I mean, I'm not even sure that it's necessary to cite specifically, striking examples. One could find really remarkable examples of the use of the English language even in our American history. Not even to go back as far as say Shakespeare or somebody who's just universally acknowledged to be a master of the tongue. But when you look at our writers like Hawthorne and Melville and Emerson and Thoreau, these are men who had a command of our language in a way that we really can't even hope to reobtain in many cases. And so it's a great training in our language to read them. But you can also look at things that are much more applicable to our present day situation in the form of the speeches or the debates that were given by presidents in the past. Look at Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, a man whose role in our country's history, I think, is to put it at the very least questionable. I mean, I think that he's probably responsible for bringing in the era of American democracy, and there's a great deal that can be said about Lincoln, and much of it would be negative, not all of it. But when one looks at his use of the American language, and I use that word advisedly, American language, his American idiom, it is just a magnificent use of speech. It's an incredible use of rhetoric. It's a powerful and potent use of it, which comes down to us even to this day with expressions that we can draw upon in our common discourse as Americans. So that this shows instances of where these things can be found, but really just turning to the past and leafing through our old literature is sufficient to give a sense of these things. There's also a lack of complexity on the syntactical level. We don't use the same complexity of structural phrasing as we once did. This both in writing and in the spoken word. And it seems to me that this probably negatively impacts our ability to think and might also be a result, a consequence of our inability to think with the same clarity and the same ease, and even, in a certain sense, the same, how can I put it, agility that we once possessed in our country. The use of language in America was once highly regarded. It was very important to be able to produce, sound and competent rhetoric. Speech makers were very, very highly regarded. And this is a special part of our country that I think we really need to try to reclaim. As a more recent example, look at
It's all
H.L.
gone
Mencken.
to sales, John. It's all gone to sales.
Right,
all that
exactly.
rhetorical energy.
Yes, it has. And what's interesting about it is that even that, we think of the old seller of snake oil back in the American far west, right? This kind of classic American figure who went around peddling nostrums that were completely worthless in themselves. How did he do that? He did it by convincing people to buy his wares. Now, I'm not suggesting we need to be snake oil salesmen by any means, but what I'm suggesting is that there's something even in, say, the far west, which is kind of regarded as this rugged, sort of crude and free-for-all scenario, in which rhetoric, the use of language, was so important and it was so central to society that even somebody to sell something had to have a real command of the language. Nowadays, you have to have a command of human psychology or consumer psychology. You've got to have enough money to spend it in the right professionals who can tell you exactly what snappy little phrase to put on that's going to keep in people's heads when you add it to the right jingle and things like that. But it's just another great sign of the decadence in which we've fallen.
Yeah, if I could just jump in really quickly, and also, folks, let me know if the audio levels are roughly the same between all three of us at this point, so that you can just crank the volume up and have us about equal. That would be great. But this is a really fascinating conversation. It's a real shame that we don't have about 5,000 people watching live right now. So, folks, if you could grab the URL, share it with your circles of influence while we're live here on Tap, and maybe we can get some more people to join and learn a bit, because this is extremely important. This speaks directly to the tools with which we think. Those are words. Those words are constructs. If we don't have the constructs, the words for our own defense, we cannot defend ourselves. This is what we're talking about when it goes right to the actual machinery of going free, and how we effectuate such magnificent results where we see so little results or no results or deleterious consequences for the use of anti-white language, despite the fact that so many seem to think, and some people are perfectly honest and wonderful folks, and they're new to going free. They've never heard of it before, and they say, well, what's the difference between what you all are doing and a snarky, ironic, flippant response where I simply just invert what the anti-whites are saying and then think I've accomplished something? What's the same thing, isn't it? No, it's not the same thing at all. And you don't realize it, you don't discover it until you actually implement the lexicon and dialectics of going free. These are what I have referred to as thought chains. They are built with premises that create thought chains that enable you, the person who is advocating for white well-being, going free, to, of your own abilities, of your own prowess, to come to the right answers, the right conclusions in these conversations, because you have started in a place that can only lead you to a certain conclusion. The flip side of this is that the anti-white, when you force your language on them, they are on that same path and they cannot win in those conversations. That's the big difference. So, for example, we have a guy right now that I've been having a conversation with, and he said, well, the inverted all lives matter has thoroughly defeated the, what I won't say, the MLB. If you look in the mirror when you hear those words, you flip it around. We're not talking about Major League Baseball. And he was, he's right now, he's of the thought that this is as good as it gets. It's like the saying, what was the other one? It'll come back to me in a minute. It was another inversion Oh, it's okay to be white. It's okay to be white. And this idea, this inverting of anti-white lexicon or locutions, this idea that it's somehow powerful when really all of this is snarky. It's nihilistic. It is, I think, John, you used the word scoffer. It's just scoffing sort of at their language. It's saying, I know you are, but what am I? And these people are not able to go any further. And of course, I'm able to take, and I will do this in the future, I'm able to take the anti-white locutions and go up against anybody that anyone suggests using the verbiage of the anti-whites, just using these inversions, remaining within the anti-white narrative, and I will thoroughly defeat them. Just like at that very first high school where the It's Okay to Be White flyers showed up, I think it was in Maryland, and a non-white high school student defeated that argument. The very first day in an interview, the non-white high school student said, apropos, of course it's okay to be white. It's just not okay to be a racist. That's it. That's the end of that argument. And that's why you have to get out of the anti-white narrative and into a lexicon that empowers you. Now, specifically, and John really just spoke to my heart there a moment ago, and I'll pass it right back so we can hear more from the two of you. The specificity of language that we had in the past is dead or dying. It's nearly dead. It's on life support. And you end up having people, and this, of course, there are many causes for this, the dumbing things down so that everybody can be the same, part of anti-whiteism, a consequence of anti-whiteism. And you end up with people not only using numerous synonyms for a specific thought that they are trying to share that end up being off the mark by quite a little bit. And what that ends up doing, and this is the most prevalent, I mean, this is ubiquitous, it is omnipresent that this happens. What that ends up doing is that it makes it very difficult for people like myself or John or Jared to communicate to the masses ideas, constructs, etc., that will benefit them, because they're trapped in this world of fewer and fewer ideas represented by numerous synonyms, which shouldn't be the case. But you even have an environment where you have antonyms that are used, and one of the antonyms that are used by people as a synonym that I hear among educated people is innervated for energized. There are numerous examples of this. How are we supposed to actually communicate ideas that empower people when the constructs, not just the words themselves, the words are the after effect, the constructs in the colloquial are so reduced that we cannot create. And then when we come along and we say, okay, we are now Western kind, and we are serving white well-being, and we say these things, people say, well, you're making up funny words. You're making up these funny words, and don't you know you're only allowed to use the words that the anti-whites permit you to use, because those are only the legitimate words. Now, here's the thing that is the real kicker, and I'll pass it right back, and then you two can grapple with this for the enjoyment and edification.
No, I have a question
everybody.
for you two. I have a question for you two.
Well, the final thing I'll say is this, is that you see this argument that you can only use the words that the anti-whites approve, from the least educated and the least intelligent all the way up in the white sympathetic spheres to the most educated and most intelligent. These people I have had, I'm not going to name them right now because it would be too close, but to name them. But there are people that I've been friends with for decades that are graduated fabulously from fabulous universities, highly educated, extraordinarily well read, and they have argued and argued and argued with me. No, you may not. In fact, all the way back to the early 90s, when I thought I was inventing anti-white and anti-whiteism, because it wasn't in the dictionary. They weren't in the dictionaries. They weren't in the dictionary that I had in my house, which I still have. They weren't in the dictionaries of the public library. The anti-whites had cunningly, intelligently ripped that page out of the dictionaries so that we couldn't defend ourselves by saying there was this assault on our people, which meant that we had to defend our people. All the way back to then, when these individuals were saying to me, no, those aren't in the dictionary, you can't use them. And I said, well, people know what it means. They know what anti is. They know what white is. They know what the ism is on the end of words. What's the big deal? Why not you legitimize it rather than me, this peon, going out and using these arguments with people? But this is, and Jared will hear your question, but this is the sort of the perfunctory nature of attempting to communicate to our brothers and sisters, the vagues out there, what they need to know in order to be able to defend themselves in their lives, just to themselves when they look in the mirror, to improve their own lives, to protect their children, to protect their families and their communities and the like. But John, any thoughts you might have since you're our guest, and Jared, your question?
You bring up a very, very interesting conundrum that we're facing, Jason. Obviously, part of what we're doing here is, conservative in the original sense of the word. We're attempting to conserve something, and that's connected, obviously, to a sense of tradition, a sense of something that has been passed down to us. It's our heritage that we have to preserve and perpetuate. I think that a consequence of that is that we are all naturally sort of more inclined toward a conservative view of things than toward a view of things that might be willing to step out and produce novelties, or that might say there's a problem here that we have to resolve. We've got to find a new way of confronting it because the old ways are falling flat on their face. And language is a really touchy point as far as that goes, because the idea of a neologism, this word that you bring up out of nothing, seems in a certain way to kind of strike against the tradition that we've had handed down to us. I think there are a couple of things that can be said about that. First of all, English has always been a tremendously innovative language. It has always been incredibly productive of new words to confront new situations. This is one of the great virtues, its resiliency, it's just incredible versatility. So that obviously has to be said. Even beyond that, though, I think that this gets to a wider question of, really the time in which we find ourselves, in which the old forms are passing away where they have not withered and died. And the consequence of that is that we need to find some kind of a new ground upon which to stand. We need to build it where it's not there underneath our feet, obviously with an eye toward the older forms, obviously with an eye toward our traditions, informed at every step by where we've been, because we do have that sense of conservation, and we cannot lose it without losing what is essential to our attempt here, to our very mission. But if we just leave it at what's been given to us, one of the major problems with that is that it has been under assault now for 100 years by very, very innovative and clever people who have produced this kind of a language, which we all find ourselves using here and there. I mean, even those of us who make the greatest efforts to escape will find ourselves now and then falling into the trap of simply, assuming common use with terms, with words that have these secret barbs in them that have been laying there precisely to catch us in the throat and snag us like fish. And so I think that that's one of the things that really has to be foremost in our minds, and clearly was, Jason, when you began this work so long ago, that you continued up until the present day. With I'm sure the people who are familiar with it and have put these terms to use, they can attest to the great usefulness of it, the great need of something like that in our time, because the old concepts do have to be renovated. They have to be resurrected and brought back into use. But in many cases, we're fighting a new war on new ground that's been produced only very recently. We need to make use of the great resources of our language, the great just remarkable richness and abundance and the productivity of the English tongue in order to face these things.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss, and maybe we could have like a specialty episode just on language, because I might even you're addressing, both of you are addressing the question that I have, and I'll mention it, but with the caveat that I don't even know if it's worth getting into. I mean, Jason is having a great amount of success, and it's kind of like getting under the hood of what he does, because the question is essentially, as we've been dancing around it, how you escape that quicksand of, if we want to communicate with a fair number of people and the discourse has lowered to this abysmal level, but we also want to raise people up to these higher standards and virtues, where's that dance? Where's that balance? How do you dip down so you hit enough people, you emotionally charge enough people, and you set a little light bulb off in enough people where you're not just accused of, sitting in an ivory tower and talking to your three friends who share your intelligence level, but then so what? You want to affect change, but you don't want to just say, well, and I understand the practicality of this. I've seen people in the chat saying, well, Trump had to use like a fourth or fifth grade reading level kind of vocabulary, and if he didn't, he wouldn't have gotten elected. Different conversation as to whether or not that was worth it. Regardless of whether you think of Trump, the fact of the matter is he did use language and the force of his personality to gather this movement around him, at least for some time, right? So that was my question, but I feel like that could take the whole rest of the show, and I don't even know if it's worth getting into. But you are our guest, and I would not be doing my job if I didn't give you a chance to respond to that. But again, that was really with both of you in mind. I mean, John, of course, you're a writer, you're a great appreciator of the English tongue and well versed, well read in the great tradition of our Western canon. And Jason, you have been having this great success of affecting people's lives. We're seeing it happen. So maybe we can make some brief comments on it now, and maybe we'll do other shows that get more into the nitty gritty, and maybe that's the sole focus. But John,
We'll probably,
as our guests, anything?
it would definitely be worth doing an entire show on that single question, because there's so much to be said about it. I will be as succinct as I can be. And really, I could just leave it at this, that Jason is the man to ask about this, and not myself, because I, as you know me, Jared, I tend, without even wanting to err in the other direction, which is, toward a degree of, I don't know, I don't have this, well, one thing that I could say, I suppose, is if we go back to the old kind of populist rhetoric in the United States, we find that rhetoric itself was of a very high caliber. I'll return to the speeches of Lincoln. These were the speeches that were widely regarded. They were responsible for propelling him to the presidency in many cases. They are expressions that have come down to us from that time. They remain in our common vocabulary. One sees them popping up in discourses even to this day. But these are speeches that were given in a popular context. Now, we're living in different times than Lincoln, because in our time, we have these wonderful things like the television and the internet that really have not done a great deal for us on the level of our intellects and our language, so far as I'm concerned. It's an entirely different discourse. But the question of, in my personal opinion, it is probably best to err toward the more complex use of language, the more correct use of language, than in the other direction, even if it seems like there might be some temporary results which one could gain as a consequence of the other movement. Populism in our time sort of compels us to go in that direction, but I think there are really a great many problems with populism, and I don't see how we can really hope for much from it. But that really does enter into a wholly different terrain. But as I said, Jason is the man to ask about this.
Well, we did want to get to populism and elitism too, and I will say, as maybe a way to, what I'm getting from your question, and to set this to Jason for a moment, is it kind of like teaching a person where you maybe want to put it just a little ahead of them. So in this case, you wouldn't want to stoop to the average American reading level right now, but you wouldn't want to have this highfalutin PhD level kind of discourse if you were on public television. You have to be able to sell it. Like this has come up a few times, Jason. It came up when I was on Yiz's show recently. This is one quick way to think of it. Again, whether you like him or not, Joe Rogan has a tremendously popular podcast in the United States and probably in many other countries as well. Who would you want to see on Joe Rogan if Joe Rogan gave 2 or 3 hours to someone from our circles and said, I'm going to give an open-minded, uncensored airing of your whole thing? Or take the personality out of it. So let's say it's not about me or Jason or John or other people you may like or not like in these spheres. Who, if there was someone who imbibed all of this person's material and could be a very good representative of what they're about, who would you want to be, have that golden opportunity to speak to millions of people? It would have to be someone who had the understanding, as we're talking about, and had the intelligence, but it's funny, I'm already taking more time than I wanted to, forgive me, but I'll just wrap it up quickly by a couple things. First of all, we use this word intelligence very broadly too, but I say this a lot. Social intelligence goes a long way. It's not just about this very academic, throwing stats, throwing facts and figures. So you have to have a person that weds that kind of analytical mind with a social intelligence, which brings me back to where I was beginning. Maybe it's, and Jason, I want to get your thoughts on this, but maybe it has to do with that idea of how we teach people or how we inspire people, where you just put it a little bit ahead of them. So maybe there's something to that. But Jason, what are your thoughts?
If I might, just very briefly, on the Joe Rogan question, my money would be on Jason.
He'd be a good bet. I'd rather see Jason than most other people, huh?
Well, I very much appreciate that from both of you, the two high quality folks that you are. That's quite an endorsement. So I really appreciate that. And so that we can keep the conversation going and we can bookmark this. I'd love to come back and have an entire tap on language. That would be fantastic. Maybe we could do like a two-parter where it's like the learning in public and is part one, and then part two is on tap. That would be kind of
That's an interesting idea. That's a great idea. Yeah.
A crossover there. That would be great. And then we could get everybody going from one to the next. So that would be really exciting. I'll just say
We'll do that.
My experience was that really, I guess, chance put me in a great spot. And I guess for my desire to do good for our people, because it started off with children that were, my age. I was a 11-year-old, and then it worked up through, of course, the teenage years. And then I got into employment and I worked both blue and white collar professions. So I was confronted with people who had wildly disparate backgrounds, and also in Northern Virginia, outside Washington, D.C., really heterogeneous racially. So people who had different backgrounds, people who had different levels of education, different levels of intelligence, and different types of intelligence, not just levels of intelligence. And I made the arguments that I was told to make by the old timers and how to bring folks over. And I experimented with some new ideas, some of my own. Some of them fell flat on their face. I was totally committed in the Aristotelian method of, whatever was empirical is what mattered. Even if I thought about it long enough and it seemed like it would work, it seemed like it was correct, I would still subject it to the scientific method. And then if it wasn't working, I dumped it. And it went so far as I would run experimental leafleting campaigns in different towns across Virginia and just see how much the response was, how many people were interested, what kind of verbiage were they interested in, what were they hearing and processing. So I continually, and then this is my suggestion and the way that we continue to go, is that I think in some sense, there's a big part of me I think it's regrettable. When I first started writing Go Free, and it was those first pamphlets, and I have to find some of those because they were, they were like 20 pages long. I wrote with the words that specifically said what I was trying to say. And it looked good to people who were, quite educated, and especially with high verbal IQs. And they said, wow, you're being very specific here but nobody else was getting it. And it took some humility on my part to go back again and again to people, to keep resubmitting the text to folks of different education levels and the like, for them to say, oh no, I actually got to the point where I was saying, here's the text, just circle every word you don't know. And it was unreal how many, even college educated individuals from around the globe, the thing is just, if it was digitally, they would highlight, and if it was in printed form, they would circle for me. And I had to keep rewriting and rewriting so that it was in even though it wasn't as precise as I wanted, it was in a language that they could receive. And that's really what matters, because an excuse for me has never been enough. So I can't say I failed and here's a great excuse. I don't allow myself to do that. And the people who have worked for me, I don't accept excuses. So when I've managed folks, and because that's how I am with myself. And ultimately, the last thing I'll say about this is, stepping back to the beginning of that question, is that in application of the specific words that were chosen, etc., I was always trying to achieve the tightest verbiage that an individual could assimilate and then use in the world around them, so that they could spread it, because that was extremely important. It wouldn't be any good if I could articulate something in a way that they could understand, but then could not reproduce. So I needed the folks to be able to reproduce. That's how anti-white and anti-whiteism for me was such an epic discovery, because if I could, and everybody can do this in your lives, you're going to have people who have never heard the word anti-white, have never heard of anti-whiteism to represent all of those doctrines that in some way victimize Western kind. You just use those words and make sure you pay attention to their eyes, because the moment they hear you encapsulate with a single construct, and therefore all of the derivative constructs that they can begin to put together on their own, the moment you do that for them, it is like the sun has ripped through the clouds. I mean, it's so cliche and so true. And so that's where I go to. I meet the person where they are. So in one sense, I find this extraordinarily lamentable, because I would like to speak in a more precise language, and I would like us all to be able to think, because speaking in the precision, as I started with my first response, is thinking in precision. So I would like us all to be there, but we're simply not there. So I find it lamentable. On the other side, I just fully accept what reality is going to require in order to get that outcome of improving the lives of individual Westmen, men, women, and children. And the bottom line is, with these words, Western kind, for example, everybody knows, if they never heard it before, they know what it is immediately. It didn't matter whether the people were construction workers or they were lawyers that I worked with. They immediately got it. It didn't matter whether they were a plumber or an accountant that I worked with. When I talked about anti-whiteism, they immediately understood what anti-whiteism was, and they didn't question me, because they weren't in competition with me to try to, I guess, within these white sympathetic spheres, make me look bad or get people to ignore me or whatever it was. They weren't in any sort of competition. So they just accepted the verbiage for the empowerment that it gave them. And internally, as they dealt with themselves, the ideas that they were brainwashed with. And John, if you haven't seen it, you really have to see this on, I've set it aside. I cut it apart as a standalone video now. This 18-year-old beautiful young woman, and she's having that moment we talk about, that all of us have felt, where it's that moment of purest beauty and heroism and glory, because she's deciding at 18 that she's sick and tired of the way she and our people are being treated. She wants to feel pride for our people. She wants our people to be able to celebrate our achievements, etc., to not be white erased. And she's now facing the paths of which to take. Is she going to make that error and head down one of these villainy roles that she sees as options within the anti-white narrative, which is where she's living, and in which case she'll have a particular dress, a particular language that she'll speak, a particular icons that she'll use that will ruin her life? Or is she going to go like the path of going free, where she's going to be a hero in our story, where she's going to be able to defeat those? I mean, you can imagine, I give the example, I think on that video, I'll pass it right back so we can keep rolling. But the example I give is, I think on the video, conversation with her parents. Let's say her parents don't feel the same way that they're very scared of the world, the anti-whites. They're scared of what will become of their daughter if she starts to speak out against anti-whiteism. And so they want to discourage that. What will happen with that relationship if she comes home and she begins with this monomaniacal focus on some other race of people or several races of other people, and she's just cussing them or whatever it is, and then the parents are going to be fearful for what's going to, that's going to strain that relationship. It's going to make her life miserable, versus coming home and using the lexicon of going for using our story, which is, this is where the people get it really wrong. They think it's just another set of words. It's not just another set of words. It's a completely different worldview. That's what you have to accept. And those other folks also that get it wrong, where they say it is for optics, they are under the delusion that we are actually villains in the anti-white narrative, and we're trying to conceal this with some sort of layers of optics cucking, when nothing could be further from the truth. So if you're here, if you're listening to my voice and you think that this is some endeavor to conceal that we are really like you because you're some sort of villain in the anti-white narrative, well, you are flat out wrong. We're nothing like you. We have a completely different moral compass. And we also are not being led around by the nose by the anti-whites, who are having you do, as a villain in the story, exactly what they want you to do. So this is how important, I would just, the final note I will make here in this poetry prose is that how important is language? And before we move on here, how important is language and the words we use and the story we're in? Well, it's this young woman's life right now. Where is she going to end up? If she goes down that ugly path, everyone knows where she's going to end up. Her life is going to be miserable. She'll be white flighting into horrible things. If she goes a very different route, going free, then the stratosphere is only the beginning. I'll pass it right back.
Yeah, just to quickly round off this question of language, Jared, unless you have another question or observations or remarks to make about it. But I did just want to say, first of all, regrettably, I've not seen that video, Jason, but I will absolutely remedy that. I'm going to look that up as soon as we're done with this, as a matter of fact. I think that the way you've described it, it makes it sound like a very, very intriguing and very, very inviting glimpse into what language can do for us. And I would point out that, everything that you've said, Jason, I agree entirely with it. I think that it would be a mistake to say that we all have to use language in exactly the same way in all cases, right? I mean, obviously language, particularly English, is capable of molding itself to different scenarios and different contexts and different situations, and that's one of its great merits, and that should be fully exploited by us. So if you're writing a pamphlet for public consuming, that obviously consumption, that's obviously different than if you're writing lyrics for a song, Jared. If you're writing, the narratives that you put into your books, Jason, the fiction that you put in there as well, or the autobiography or things like that. If you're writing a poem, all of these have different audiences, first of all, but they also have just a different idiom, a different natural style that should accompany them, and that should be exploited, I think, to the fullest by us. So it's not a question of simply, deciding how we're going to use language, and then we have to use it always in that particular way. If you're giving a speech, it's a different scenario than if you're in a private conversation with a friend, right? These are different cases. You have to use language in a different way. I think there are some general rules that could be laid down. I mean, a few of them that I'm particularly keen on. One is the obscenities. I just think that we should really reduce the amount of obscenities that we commonly have in our language. This is not simply a moral question, although I think there are moral questions involved in it. But just from the point of view of our command of our language, obscenities become crutches to us. They stand in for real words and real concepts, and we just kind of crawl around using these words to mean any old thing. Which, first of all, is demeaning to the world in which we find ourselves because of the nature of obscenities, but it's also demeaning to our intellects and our ability to, really fully grasp what we're looking at. The other thing that I think speaks directly to what you were saying, Jason, is the question of what we presently call memes. And I'm very, very contrary. I'm thoroughly against this idea that language is a structure of memes. I think that that is, again, demeaning of language. It is a demoting of language. Language is not just a spontaneous and absolutely unconscious reproduction, parrot-like, of things that have come into our heads. The moment it becomes that is the moment we become slaves to somebody else's worldview, Jason. Is exactly what you were saying. This is really very key. We have to use our language consciously, whatever level we're using it, whatever way, context we find ourselves. It has to be conscious, and that's the great benefit of this lexicon that you're working on, Jason, that it is conscious from start to finish. And so it really does command us to be more aware of the way that we use our language, of the meaning and the consequences of our words, and to clean up our act in many cases. I mean, a meme, what is a meme? A meme is something like this superfluous like that's crept into the American language, where we say like anything with like after it, which of course means that everything we're talking about is vague. We're not certain about what we're saying. Like, of course, means that it's like something. It's not quite something else. So it's a kind of approximation. It has this sort of approximative value to our language. That kind of a thing has to be cut out. We've got to get rid of the memes. We don't want memes, and we're not trying to even plant memes. We're trying to expand awareness. We're trying to expand consciousness. And I think this is the great value of your project, Jason.
Quickly on the young woman in the TikTok video, we talked about this. We're working on it. There are a few people who have given us the same username, so we have to check if that's the right username. I know people are already saying they're trying to reach out, but if you're a guy and you have the right intention to reach out, don't. We need a woman to reach out to her first for obvious reasons. No matter how pure your intentions are, she's going to think you're reaching out as a hookup. This is just how it is. It's just how it is. So guys, don't reach out to her. We have to find the right woman to reach out to her. If you have more info on her, reach out to Jason and I after the show. But we do want to get to her and make sure the wrong types don't get to her. But anyway, there are different levels of this, and there's a different level to the discussion and the rhetoric versus just that one little punch, that potent way. I'm hearing typing. If you could just mute for a moment, that potent way that Jason, for example, has tested words like anti-white from the get-go. Right when I met Jason, the way I described it is that it's like cutting the Gordian knot, to use something from our mythology, appropriate for John being here, as someone who loves mythology. But the impossible knot, for anyone that doesn't know, everyone was challenged. You couldn't untie this knot. And then it was Alexander that came along, right? And just, what's the quickest way? He just cut it with his sword. Sometimes it's that extremely simple, obvious thing. That is not the same thing as having a discourse and having to present your ideas on a show for an hour. But that level of being able to funnel everything into this one word or this one term, that is something on them. I guess, I don't know if this is the best way to say it, but we think of it in the age of the internet on that mimetic level or as a sloganeering level. I know those words might sound like I'm kind of detracting it, but I don't use those words in a derogatory way. I'm just invoking them as a way to say it's just this mass consciousness kind of zap into the collective psyche. That's a level of it too. But John, don't sell yourself short, because I see Jerome here, who's a great member of the community, saying he was listening in the beginning, saying that you're blowing his mind with your clarity. And you are an amazing speaker. That's one of the first things I noticed about you, how fluid and fluent you are with the English tongue. And there's tremendous power in that as well. We all do different things. Obviously, neither you or I have done what Jason has done. Jason does what Jason does in the way that he's, discovered these frames and these words and tested them, and it's extremely powerful. But you are a master of speech, and it's one of the reasons why we knew we wanted to talk to you right from the get-go a couple of years ago, and why we're still talking today. Let me say, before this exclusively becomes that show on language, we have to save this for the TAP Learning in Public crossover, which I do like that idea and we'll have to do. We do have some other kind of topics we want to get to, or some questions people had in the remaining time we had left. Now, I know this is broad, so forgive me, but hey, as we know, this is not the last time we're going to be speaking. You mentioned populism before, and these ideas, we've also been kind of dancing around this tangential, but it's very related to everything we've been talking about. This notion of elitism and populism, and having messages that can hit different intelligence levels and intelligence types and different psychology types. Again, Jason, I know that's something you've researched and thought a lot about as well as you've developed your work. John, you said something before about populism. I don't know if you were speaking specifically about language, use of language and dumbing it down. And if I remember correctly, you were saying something where it sounded like you were a little dubious on it. But what are your thoughts on this notion we hear a lot about reconciling elitism and populism? Do the people need to be led, or is there a folksy wisdom in salt of the earth people and they're not being represented, that kind of thing? And not to add too much to this, but being someone who now lives in Europe, what you can tell us about the different kind of taking the temperature of the different ways that this is developed, that this seesaw of elitism, populism has developed in European countries you're familiar with versus the United States.
Well, first of all, thank you kindly for your very generous remarks, Jared, as well to our listener. I very much do appreciate them. On this question of populism versus elitism, and to answer one of the last things that you asked, Jared, first of all, my neighbor is a shepherd. He has a very large flock of sheep, and he's just a salt of the earth kind of a man. And I find that I would so much rather speak to him about any question that comes to mind, particularly on the level of politics, day-to-day living, obviously agriculture and things like that, because he's an expert, than to say a number of college professors that I personally know, a number of university graduates, a number of PhD carrying, card holding members of the academia. I simply would rather speak to him because I find that he is wiser than they are. They know a great deal more than he does. He's an ignorant man by that kind of a standard, but he is so much wiser than they are that I would rather see him in the presidency of Italy and probably the United States as well than the people who are presently running the show in our these two countries. So that's one thing that really has to be said, that the question of elitism versus populism, I think, has a natural place in human life because there are different levels of study, there are different levels of intelligence, there are different levels of ability in any field you please, and that includes absolutely as well the great questions that confront human beings. I have a sense of philosophy, for example, that is high enough that there are very, very few, just a couple handfuls of men that I would actually apply that word philosopher to. Clearly, I'm not among them. So, there is a way in which that sort of hierarchy is simply natural. It proposes itself naturally when we're looking at human societies and the human existence. And to try to avoid it by saying that, everything should be democratized or that everyone should have the same chance in life or that everyone there shouldn't be any distinctions between human beings. That seems to me to be a grave folly, and one that will lead inevitably to not only to the ruin of a great many talented men, but also to the presuppositions for the kind of secret cryptocratic rule that we see in the contemporary day, where the people who are really governing the situation are in the shadows. Nobody knows who they are. We don't know their faces or their names. They can do that because there's this sort of presupposition that everyone should just be like the guy down the street and our president should speak like him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, the people who are really ruling in our world very easily find their excuse to just slip into obscurity and to rule from the shadows in a kind of spider-like existence. There are these animals, the solifugids in the American Southwest. They're these little, really kind of terrible little animals. They're sort of like spiders, but they're very fast, and they're called solifugids because they flee from the sun. And I think of our contemporary rulers like that. But the point being that elitism in our day has come to represent that class. It's come to represent the people who think that since they are capable of, earning great and tremendous amounts of money, and they can use that money in order to make other money, they should have the power to command other human beings because other human beings are less valuable than they are. In the past, there of course have been, sort of aristocratic rulers who believed that they were superior to the common run of men and things like that. That's part and parcel of human nature. There will always be such haughtiness and pride. But there were also complementary concepts, things like noblesse oblige, this idea that you had an obligation toward the common people precisely because of the responsibility that had been invested in your position as a ruler, as a hereditary ruler of the state. You grew up with this concept of duty and responsibility, and it informed your every act. To break out of that, to be a kind of monstrous ruler, actually took a certain kind of real corruption of personality, a certain sort of force and strength even. In our day, it's just par for the course, because in order to get there, you simply have to be an elitist. You have to think that you're better than people because you're cleverer than they are, and you're better able to make money, and perhaps you're a little bit more ruthless and ambitious than they are, et cetera, et cetera. So the discourse of elitism versus populism has been corrupted in our time. And also on the other end, the idea of populism itself is this force that's going to save us. I think it might have some promise in certain contexts, but we've also seen it fall very, very much flat on its face in recent years. The past 4 years attest to, unfortunately, the spectacular failure of populism for the most part in the West. There have been exceptions to that, fortunately, but for the most part, we've just seen it corrupted and turned around and manipulated very, very slyly in order to become something that it wasn't from the start. And this is a consequence, again, of thinking that we can resolve things democratically through democratic procedures. Now, the idea of democracy as in political representation to all human beings is not necessarily a bad one on the face of it. There are certain, there's a longstanding Republican American tradition, Republican in the sense of republic, which has it that individuals should have the ability to have a say in their representation. That's not inherently an evil or stupid idea, obviously. I mean, our country has survived for a very great many years on the back of that idea. But
it's been in many Western countries for a long time.
It has been. I mean, there are, Iceland is a classic example of a democracy. I think it's the oldest in the world by certain estimates. It's very much a Western idea that comes to us also from our British traditions, and this can be found in Northern Europe, all over the board. So I don't mean to, simply throw all of this out by saying that there's no merit to it, but there's something in democratic thinking in particular, and particularly in our contemporary day, which is poisonous in my view, because it ignores that element of natural hierarchy in human life. Now, the problem is that we have to reestablish that natural hierarchy. We have to reconstitute it, just like we have to reconstitute our language, which has been debilitated over years and years of conscious misuse and conscious abuse. The same thing has to happen in our political and social orders, but it's very, very complicated. It's, I don't want to say that it's impossible, because, not being able to imagine the path forward doesn't mean that there is not a path forward. But it's something that will require our conscious and aware efforts at every step of the way, because there are so many different kinds of pitfalls into which we can fall. We can fall into the pitfall of elitism, this idea that technicians need to be our governors, people who know the science, right? They know the science, and so since they know the science and they have the studies underhand, they should rule.
It begs the question as to what we call elite, though, because
it does.
That's not always what, as we've discussed, that's not always what's been thought of as elite, just because you're a technician.
No, precisely. I mean, it comes back to the question of the worldview in which we're living. I mean, Jason, I endorse that word that you used very strongly. It's, this idea that our view of the world is manipulated, it's changed, it's altered by the language that we use, by the social environment in which we find ourselves. And one of the consequences of that is, again, we see the corruption of words. Elite is another word that has been corrupted, because it really just means, the best, the highest. It no longer means that. The elite of today are the best, perhaps, making money. They're the best at manipulating markets on the grand scale. They're the best at destroying national economies in many cases, but they're not the best in the moral sense. They're not aristocrats in the original sense of that, from the Greek aristos, which means, the best, the greatest, the most virtuous and noblest. That is no longer the sense of elitism. And again, this is probably a word that we have to reclaim, but it's also a very useful shorthand for what we're talking about. So that's the problem. Dr. Alexander Wolfes, who has a number of books published, excellent, first-rate books, talks about the hostile elite, which does recognize that in a certain way, these are very, very intelligent men. We cannot underestimate them. They've gotten to their position through the exertion of a ruthless will, a really merciless will, and great mental acuity. And in many cases, an ability to, not indifferent ability to delude people and to confuse minds, particularly about what they are under the guise of philanthropy, for example. This is a classic move on their part. So these are men of some talent and some innate ability. It's a very limited kind, but it's there. I mean, they are, in a certain sense, an elite. In a limited sense, they are an elite. But it's not the sort of elite that we want to have, right? There's a way in which it's not a virtuous thing to be the best at making money. That's just not something a person should be proud of. Obviously, to be a good household owner, to be somebody who can manage his affairs. The idea of economy comes from the Greek which it means household. It's your ability to give a nomos, a law, a rule to your household. That's the idea of economy in its original sense. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to be good with your resources. It's a good thing to be a manager of resources such that you can actually, have a comfortable, good life for your family. You can produce that kind of an abundance for your family. But that's a whole different world from being able to ruthlessly obtain mammon for obtaining mammon. That's a different kind of soul that we're talking about there. And that, so if it is an elite, it is a very strange kind of elite. It's not the sort of elite we want ruling our countries.
Yeah, you could probably speak to this, but I know that hasn't always been the case where simply being the best merchant was the highest value. In fact, it was there were other castes or classes of people who rightly were in positions of influence because of other traits, and it was kind of looked down on somewhat if that's all that you were about. Uh, there's a natural disgust sometimes even to some of that kind of thing when I hear about people break down these little uh, sayings they have about, well, everyone's always selling something. And I mean, I understand what that's saying. In a deeper way, it might be saying, well, you're always, look at what we're discussing today. You're always trying to communicate something. You're always trying to get your point of view across. So in a very broad sense, you might say, everyone's always selling something, but it's just seems like one of those, as we've been discussing, these modern contemporary inversions and cheapenings of language. But at any rate, I know we might have some questions from the chat. We're already going a little over where we wanted to.
If I could just very quickly say something, I think this is actually really worth mentioning. There is a novel and a film that was based on the novel, both of them excellent, that actually really touch on this question that we're discussing about the nature of aristocracies, the past aristocracies, and money getting and the relation between the two. For anyone who thinks that the aristocracies were simply about greed and, consuming resources, being the richest and biggest guy on the field. The book is an Italian book, originally Il Gattopardo. It's translated as The Leopard by Tommaso de Lampedusa. And it talks about the point at which Italy was being unified and the transformation that was affected in the aristocratic households of the time from the point of view of a prince, an Italian prince. And his attempt to maintain his position despite the introduction of this new unified Italy and the kind of republican sentiments that it brought with it, and his relation as well to the merchant class of the time, and how that was not, the ability to make money was not regarded as being the same thing as an aristocratic heritage. It's an excellent book, an excellent film with Burt Lancaster in the leading role, an Italian film, but Burt Lancaster plays the leading role. Both of them are absolutely to be looked at for this particular question and for the clarity that it brings to us about the real nature of these things.
Thank you for that. On that note, I was going to say, Jason, I don't know if we have some questions, but I did mention in the lead up to this, we wanted to ask you, perhaps it's quick, or perhaps you have a few things to say about it. But we're getting some news that Salvini has allied with other people in the European Union from Poland and Hungary. And there was talk we were seeing in the chat over the last week or two about this so-called alliance of what they're trying to do. But we've also had guests like our friend Elenia from Italy herself, who feels like Salvini was just kind of all this promise and then nothing really happened. And I think, I don't want to misrepresent her, but Jason, if I'm remembering correctly, I think she even wondered allowed if he had been controlled opposition. So I know people wanted us to ask you, for anyone that's new to John, John actually lives in Italy. That's why we're asking him about Italy. He's lived there for some time now. So do you have anything to say on that? Or if not, maybe in the spirit of that, anything, any news, any relevant news the TAP audience might want to hear about things going on in Italy or more broadly Europe and how it relates to our present situation, or what you all are seeing from the United States, how Europe is viewing what's going on in the United States right now. So take your pick of any or all of those, and then Jason can bring us into some of the chat questions.
Well, Italian politics. Speaking of the Gordian knot, Jared, here we are. Italian politics is as much a mess as always, and the only thing that I know with any certainty about the political scene here in Italy is that it is eternally premature to try to draw any conclusions about it. So I will preface my remarks on Salvini in particular by saying that he might up and surprise me. I hope he does, because I also have found myself rather deluded by Salvini. I don't know how to sum this up. Practically speaking, Salvini was at a certain point, very, very prominent in the Italian government, and he managed to effect some very, very good changes, particularly on the level of immigration, despite the fact that he was not the prime minister. He was a lesser minister, but nonetheless, he had a great deal of influence, and it was all for the good. He has a very, very strong rhetorical ability. That actually, it would be interesting to go into that because it has a lot to do with what we've been discussing, but I'll leave that aside for the present moment. He has sound principles based on everything that I know about the man, the way that he speaks, at least. To the extent to which those sound principles actually play out in his private life is another question. So there's obviously an open question there about the degree of consistency in him, but he's also an Italian, so we have to bear that in mind as well. Recently, the government has taken a nosedive practically into just the most horrendous, the kind of the dark shadow of populism, I guess is the way that it could be put. It really showed the hollowness to at least a certain wing of the populist movements here in Italy, namely the Five-Star movement. We talked about this, I think, in our first conversation, and I've always been very contrary to the Five-Star movement. I'm sorry to say that I was right about that. I really wish that I hadn't been. But the Five-Star movement is just, it was a stage piece from the very start, and the people who actually believed in it have all jumped ship because they recognize that there's nothing that's salvageable in it. It has become a puppet and a simple extension of the establishment parties here in Italy, and Salvini was ejected completely from the government. There were a number of court cases that were brought against him, which he managed to ride through without any difficulty. His being outside of the sphere of the government, to my mind, was a very good sign. I mean, he was responsible for actually causing the government to fall in the first place, and there were some questions about that, whether it was a good move, a clever move politically. But he did really, I mean, he was a persona non grata in the Italian government for many, many months. Recently, he was brought back into it. He made an alliance with the ruling powers, with the establishment parties, and this alliance is supposed to be short-term. It's supposed to end in June, in which the idea is that the Italians will be permitted in the first time in some time to actually vote for who's going to rule their country, who is going to be the prime minister. It remains to be seen whether that will actually materialize, because, as I said, nothing is certain in Italian politics. It's always just this continual, very, very complicated game that's played on a variety of different levels, and it's incredibly difficult to follow, even for somebody who really knows the scene much better than I do. I've had that confirmation from people whose opinion I respect on these matters implicitly. So all of that is just to set up the present situation. Salvini presently is in a ruling coalition with the establishment parties of the Italian government, which have been responsible for leading Italy into blunder after blunder and practically devastating the country on the level of the economy, on the level of its social values. They've done their best to destroy it as well on the level of its ethnic content, and they've made great head. They've done a very fine job of doing that, sadly. So he's right now in this kind of a strange position in which he has a certain ability to speak, but he's not at the same time the opposition to the government. He's not in that position of that oppositional place. He's part and parcel of the ruling coalition, and so his ability to actually critique it is somewhat curtailed. Whereas before he maintained a great deal of silence about what was going on, particularly with the extremely stringent COVID regime which has been put into place. And so it's really very questionable what's happening with Salvini, if he has any plans, if he's just kind of winging it at this point, if he can be redeemed from this kind of limbo into which he seems to have projected himself. He's very competent on the political level in many ways. Some people believe he's made some very huge blunders in late times, and so it's difficult to say if he's made another one of those. As far as this alliance goes with other populist forces in Europe, I don't know to what extent it can bear fruit. It really remains to be seen. It remains to be seen if we can actually return to elections. If we return to elections in June, there will be, by all accounts, on all sides of this, an overwhelming show of force for what's called the center-right, which is Salvini's coalition. Salvini would probably be the next prime minister, the way things presently stand. If not Salvini, then somebody who belongs to his party, the Lega. That's probably what would happen if the vote were allowed. And that's why the Italian government has been so carefully avoiding the vote now for so long, because nobody wants that at those levels. So what would he do if he arrived? I don't know. When you look at the people who finance these parties, the Lega is the only one that does not have compromising financing behind it. It's the only one. Even Giorgia Meloni has certain financiers who are a little bit dubious. I think even the Heritage Foundation is mixed up in that. She also recently joined the Aspen Institute. I don't know why she would have done that, but it seems like a terrible move. A very, very worrying move for anyone who's watching. And she did at the same time reject a large advance from George Soros, who offered to give her a great deal of money. So it's very confusing. It's very difficult to know what to think about all of this. If I had to put my hopes in any really solid and possible political figure, it would be Salvini, but they would probably be pretty slight hopes at this point. I don't know what he could possibly
But John,
do.
What is the structure of this alliance that we're hearing about with European EU politicians in Hungary and Poland?
It's difficult. It's difficult to say. I mean, it's really hard to say. Very often so much is made out of these things. They're really overblown for mediatic reasons. The media wants to take these things and run with them and show, look, the populist threat is still looming over Europe. We've got to do something about these Nazis, right? Something like that. So it's hard to say if there's really something there. I suspect that since there's so much smoke, there's probably some fire. I don't know what the nature of it would be. It really depends on whether Salvini can actually gain a position of power within the Italian state. And he has all the cards lined against him at this point, because the Italian government has been limping on for so long. I don't see why it won't do so for another couple of years, and that might be all the time we have with the way things are going. So
the quick scan I did of articles about it spoke more to it's something happening right now. It's not dependent on Salvini, the outcome of a possible election later this year, as you were saying, and it's for a realignment of these kinds of values in the EU, that those three, that Salvini and whoever he partnered with in Hungary and Poland, were going to have some kind of alliance where they would form more of a center of gravity in the EU Parliament. But again, that I can't speak to the details. That's just the kind of the outline I got.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was so. This obviously comes down as well to European politics, and European politics is framed structurally so that the European Parliament is kind of like a lame duck. There's not a great deal that it can do. It cannot propose new legislation. It has legislation proposed to it. So even if he were able to effect some kind of a change on the level of the European Parliament, I don't imagine that would lead necessarily to any kind of immediate consequences. It might have a kind of favorable tint. It would add a favorable tint to the situation, but I don't think it would have any earth-shattering consequences. If he were to obtain a role of some centrality and influence in the Italian government, it might have some real effects on the level of the balance of powers within contemporary Europe, because Italy is a major player in the contemporary European scene, secondary to Germany, France, and England, even though England's obviously in this kind of a limbo itself. But nonetheless, it is one of the major founders of the European Union. It is one of the major economic players in the global scene, not just in Europe. It is an industrial nation of the first rank. And so, I mean, all of this means that if Salvini were to become the prime minister with a ruling coalition that could sustain him, which is to say, enough parliamentarians that he could actually get something done, then a an alliance of this kind with prominent populist figures would have or could have some really beneficial consequences, both for the Italians and more broadly speaking for Europe. Those are a great many ifs, and they're really, really up in the air. Again, the way that I've seen things going, I would be shocked if the agreement to go to the election in June were carried through. I would be shocked. I've been shocked by Italian politics before on numerous occasions, so that doesn't mean anything, but it really would be stunning to me. I think that the goal right now is to prolong the situation as long as possible. It's a waiting game. They're just attempting to procrastinate for as long as they can while structures are being put in at the European level, supranational structures that can effectively cut the legs out from any populist movements in the future. And that's where the game is really being played. Our game has to be on the other end, I would maintain. We cannot win the level of national politics unless an extremely favorable star alignment comes up and just changes things to such an extent that we really are offered a golden opportunity, which would be once in a lifetime. That could happen. It's something to hope for, but it's not something to plan on. We need to work at the local level of localities. We need to work on the level of our towns, our cities, our neighborhoods, our communities, the level of our friends and family. We need to work on the level of our language, our personal empowerment, our personal perfecting our personal, as much as we possibly can, we need to work on that level of improving our life on a day-to-day basis and the things that are concretely around us. Because that's the only way that anything is going to change in this world, unless, again, we're given some kind of fantastic, splendid possibility, which would not depend on our actions, but merely on chance. And we cannot depend on chance. The hour has grown late for that. We need to work on things that we can work on. So I don't put a great deal of hope in Salvini. If I had to put money on any Italian candidate to lead us into a better Italian, Italy, a better Europe, it would be on Salvini. But there are so many contingencies there, and even Salvini himself is a kind of open question. So I don't know.
Well said, and I know, Jason, you'd wholeheartedly agree. People in the chat wanted to hear, and there it is. But as we say, you can't get too excited about these headlines. I feel like every few months, guys, there's these headlines about this new possible leader, this new coalition, and this and that. What do we talk about here week in and week out? What does Jason talk about every Sunday on Going Free? What did John just say? It's you. It's your agency. It's what's around you. Every time that you think that that leader, that coalition is going to take care of things, you get excited about this headline, you share this tweet that, oh, Reuters is reporting this new coalition in the EU might be the thing. You're taking power out of yourself when you do that. So, as John said, I'm not telling you to be pessimistic about anything. In fact, this is really being the most positive you can be, is to claim your own power.
Yeah, precisely right. I mean, it's not a question of optimism or pessimism. Another couple of words that I think could really do with a thoroughgoing critique. It's a question rather of the things that we have within our sphere of influence and the things that are beyond our sphere of influence. It is important to know about what's happening in the world on the level of the nation, on the level of the development of a global governance system, which is at a very advanced stage, much more advanced than we like to think. These are important things to know about because they inform our decisions on the local level. But we cannot pretend that we as a community are going to put forth a candidate who's going to win the presidency of the United States or become the next prime minister of Italy. That's not going to happen with the way things presently are. The changes that we can affect, and we look at this from the Stoical point of view, right? I mean, it's an honorable old Roman tradition, this idea that there are things that we cannot put our hands on, and then there are other things that we can, and it would be the move, the wisdom of a man to try to look to the things that he can change.
Very, very well said. Well, this has been a magnificent tab. Not a single second of it, since we're talking about, I guess the entire time we've been talking about language, not a single second of it has been jejune. And if you don't know what that is, look it up, folks. We'll lead the charge on changing the language. But we will right now jump into some of these questions and financial gifts from you all, so that we can tap out. It's been magnificent, and we will absolutely have John back, and we'll do the crossover of the two shows. It'll be very exciting on language. Jumping right into some of these questions I saw just a moment ago. I think it was Rundus asking about where does meme or memetics come from, where it's Richard Dawkins coined it. He was an evolutionary biologist, and essentially he was communicating that you could have cultural information that would pass in the same way that genes pass, that your DNA passes. And that's essentially where it came from, if that's getting to the root of the question. We also have the great Slots, one of our magnificent champions, somebody who is taking his life and our destiny into his own hands, rather than hoping that some politician somewhere will make it all better for them. And I will just underscore very quickly what Jared George just said. If you're going free, if you believe you're going free, and you find yourself looking to these stories and suddenly getting excited, like, wow, maybe they'll do it for me, then you're not quite going free just yet. Going free is all about taking charge of yourself, getting out of that story. Ask yourself this: why would the anti-white news and potentially their entertainment report anything to you? Why would they bother to say it? Well, they're going to bother to say to you that there's this potential alliance of right wing, because that serves to bolster their anti-white narrative that they force us to live under, which is that there's this omnipresent, ever-growing force that needs to be continually suppressed, and they need to take more of your rights and liberties away so that they can suppress it and oppress it. That would be the only reason they would talk to you about such a thing. So go free if you're going free. Slots financially gifting $10 and saying everything he needed to say with those $10. Thank you so very much, dear brother. And that was over on Cash App. I will jump over here. I saw on D Live a question about how did I measure the success or failure of the leaflets when I was doing the experimenting across Virginia. There were several ways. There was the conversations on the ground when I handed out the leaflets. I waited for people to read and see what their responses would be. I had conversations with them. We scheduled meetings. So the leaflets would have the verbiage that we were experimenting with, or that I alone. Sometimes I did this by myself. And then there would be a meeting that would be scheduled. So that date would be on there. How many people showed up and showed interest? There was, in the very early on, I unwisely shared my phone number at that time on some of these leaflets. And I gauged the phone calls that came in. And then, of course, there were websites.
I'd like to hear some of those phone calls.
There must be some stories behind that one then.
Oh, there's some stories. No, some of the best.
Did you have to change your number?
Yes, I had to get. It's not. I heard this on PWR. Mark gives out his phone number freely. I don't know how, because in the U.S., oh my gosh, that phone will not stop ringing. And those anti-whites, they have such colorful language. We're talking about language. It's so colorful. It's the curse words that work for just about anything under the sun. But yeah, so there was that. And then, of course, website hits. So that's how we gauged interest and or the success, the communicative ability of the short language that was used there. And then, of course, going deeper in the actual conversations that I had on a regular basis with people. But yeah, we had police. We'll talk about some of these experiments, because we had police show up numerous times to meetings. Police drive by. In one case where it was a sedan, it was a police sedan, and it was packed full of police officers. Like something that if you would stereotypical of another group or groups of other human beings out there, it must have been, I don't know, maybe as many as 10 cops in a single police car. It was quite comical. Then the confrontations, of course, that occasionally happened. Yeah, there were some funny times doing that. We also have the a question of whether or not I was just going to address the leaflets that were distributed, and then the news, the local news of where they were distributed, did a story on it, and they said that the people passing out the leaflets, and they read exactly that they oppose anti-whiteism, and they were saying this sort. That's exactly what we want them to do on the news. We want them to call the opposition to anti-whiteism hatred and all these anti-white slurs, racism. We want them to call no white guilt, as we've seen elsewhere across the United States. We want them to call that the anti-white slurs like hate and bigotry, because that is an attack on every single white person. So, and it's proven time and again in the comments under the stories where you see white people who are clearly not in white sympathetic spheres, or if they are, it's implicit, and they're writing in the threads underneath that, what are you talking about? How can that be? That's just me and my family. I'm not going to feel any white guilt. We want them doing that. The thing though is that we need Going Free to be spread as widely as possible, so that folks are either going free or they know what it is. Our people, just knowing what it is will be enough to seriously undermine the anti-whites in their efforts when they decide to demonize the well-being of white children, white well-being. When they say white well-being is evil, we win, because that has made enemies of every single white person who isn't vehemently anti-white. So that is an extreme power. We have from the great lovely Porge the question for another scintillating mind, folks. We have the absolute best here. For John, actually a sublunary question asking about his favorite breed of dog.
Favorite breed of dog? Well, that's one I never expected to hear here. I'm partial to German Shepherds. I like German Shepherds a great deal. They're intelligent dogs. They're elegant. They're attractive. They look a bit like wolves, like domesticated wolves or something like that. Yeah, that would probably be my response to that one. Thank you very much for the interesting question.
Yeah.
Also, if I might just add a couple of very, very quick comments on the question of memes. You're absolutely right, Jason, that the origin of the idea was Richard Dawkins, and I think that it's not at all irrelevant to note that Richard Dawkins is more famously known as one of the new atheists, or as they pompously like to refer to themselves, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And this is very much connected to this idea of memes. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionist, thoroughgoing evolutionist. He reduces the human being to his mere genetics. He denies the idea of a human soul. And the consequence of that, of course, is that if you're going to find a way of describing language, probably the best way of doing it is to look at language as being a system of programming parasites that latch onto the brain. So I just thought that I'd mention that just as a kind of
very fascinating.
rounding off.
Yeah. We have the horsemen and the horsewomen of the Western sunrise here. So don't worry about that, folks.
Indeed.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, that's great. Actually, to tack that on, because that really does fill out the answer to that question, and it's very interesting. It's very interesting material. And I just remembered, actually, when I saw that. What was her name? I lost it again. European Housewife. That's right. I think was the one who said it. Said it was hilarious about all the police officers in the car. I actually also did this, and I'll share this in another show. I wanted to get, and you should have seen the faces on all of the guys that I was communicating. I always shared all of this material with guys who were bright, various educations, but much older, who had a lot more wisdom than I did, who've been in the spheres for a lot longer, to bounce off of them my ideas and results, because I knew that they would have really valuable things to add. And you should have seen their faces when I said, I really want to find out with these tests how the police are taking it. And they said, well, how are you going to find out how the police are taking it? And I said, well, I'll just go to the police station and ask them. So I actually met with a chief whose last name was Boring, but he wasn't boring at all. And we'll talk about that maybe some other time. talk about the naivete of youth.
You're planting a lot of seeds here for
Indeed.
sequels and other streams. This is I'm fascinated now. See, you're a master communicator, Jason.
Oh boy, I don't know. I could probably take that back, but it was still fun. The looks on their faces when they said, "You're going to go to the police? You're going to talk to the?" It was like, "Yeah, I'm a good guy. It won't matter." All right. Well, let's get a big round of raucous emojis together for Ascended Practitioner who continues to surprise and has hit the ground running when it comes to going free. $50 financial gift. Thank you so much, Ascended Practitioner. Says here, I'm creating a YouTube channel called Friday Night White Man Infight. We are mostly going to argue about lawnmower brands and insist on vocabulary that doesn't work. My gosh, brother, you jumped right into going free. You know exactly the folks that are out there that are making things difficult. Absolutely correct. Lawnmower brands and vocabulary, insist on vocabulary that doesn't work. And how long does something need to not work before you finally say, well, I think I'll abandon this? Like, I won't go back to any police captain anytime soon to have a conversation about what do they think about what I'm doing in their town. But that's Ascended Practitioner. Thank you so much, good brother. $50. And we have the great Yiz the Eunuch is here with 2 financial gifts. Another rising star, spectacular person doing magnificent things. Just got off right on the heels of this interview with Lauren Witzke, which was magnificent. $5 financial gift from Yiz. She writes, just had a great stream on my channel with 2 active young men of the American Patriot MAGA crowd. Well done. That's exactly where we're looking for a good, normal, decent, law-abiding, moral American folk. And thank you for doing that. She writes, we discussed linguistic mimetic warfare, specifically how powerful the terms anti-white and no white guilt are. Wanted to celebrate with you all. Well, that is a big celebration. And thank you so much for that. Big round of applause for Yiz stepping out into that community. Yes, please go ahead, brother.
No, I just wanted to thank all of the contributors to the stream, and thank you both very much, of course, for having me. It's always a great pleasure to speak to you both. These are stimulating conversations. I always enjoy them.
Well, we have 2 more financial gifts. We have another from Yiz, $5 more, another folk tithe. She writes, for the charming and erudite John Bruce Leonard. I can't recommend enough the learning in public discussions between he and Jared George. The discussions are healthy exercises for the soul. Very well written. I agree completely.
Recently had one with Yiz as well. So Yiz, thank you so much.
Yes. And finally, we have here the great Irish Ice, another magnificent champion for white well-being and endeavoring to make his entire city white positive. And this guy's really doing it. He says here with $5. Thank you so much, Irish Ice. A mass stabbing, this is terrible, took place last week in North Vancouver. And the anti-whites have turned it into a hush crime. Great use of the lexicon, brother. They've painted the non-white, anti-white suspect as the victim. So I painted the city with flyers that properly identify this monster. Promethean hails. Well, a big Promethean hails to you for taking what obviously is an affront and anger and your concern for those who were stabbed and the fear that all of our brothers and sisters are going to be experiencing as a consequence of individuals, anti-white individuals of any race, being given license, like in places like South Africa, to victimize Western kind and have their crimes whitewashed and painted over by the anti-whites in the news and entertainment media. Thank you so much for not just complaining about it, as we often see when it comes to this gallows glee that we named, where these people they get excited about something horrific to say that happened to us, and then they go sharing it all over, and they derive some sort of pleasure from sharing it. Thank you so much for doing the opposite, for making a difference in the world. What a champion, folks. Irish Ice, $5 financial gift. Over to the question widget really quickly before we tap out. We have a bunch from Jonash saying, talking about language. You should also put attention on languages of our people other than English. We will when we revisit the language subject. Hundreds of millions of whites natively speak those languages. Indeed, he writes on, if you're going to have another tab focusing on language specifically, you should definitely consider bringing on some non-English speaking guests. I guess you mean in their original tongue. And he says, it's very important for our lexicon to transcend the language barrier. Indeed, I'd love to listen to that. I'm quite interested in linguistics. Now, remember, if you are if you live in a country that is where the native tongue is something other than English, then with Going Free, if there is a perfect translation for the different words that we use or phrases that we use, the constructs, that means the exact same thing, then go ahead and give that translation, whatever that might be, to those people who don't speak English. Otherwise, give the English construct and then describe in your native tongue what it means. Westmen all over the world are very capable of adopting foreign words and understanding those concepts in their own languages and using them then in their lives. I think that brings us just about to an end of the financial gifts and questions. It has been scintillating as always. John, what are your final thoughts and where can folks find you?
I do want to address that question by Jonash. That is an excellent point. Obviously, the other European languages really do clearly deserve a great deal of time. Our focus on English is simply due to the fact that we're all Americans here. We're native English speakers. I have a particular love for my language, but I also, I speak Italian, and it's very, Jared and I, we've had many conversations about the differences between English and Italian in many different ways. There's a great deal that could be said about that, but also the similarity, the base similarity of these things. They all come back to our European heritage. And I think it's a great point that you bring up. When we do have that stream on language, we'll make a point absolutely of focusing on that question. So with that, again, gentlemen, thank you once again for a deeply fascinating conversation. We've touched on a great many very important points. I'm going to very much be looking forward to this continuation of our discussion on language. There's an enormity to be said here, and it's a theme that really cannot bear too much attention. So once again, my work can be found on my website. That's johnbruceleonard.com, John bruceleonard.com. My novel is available there for purchase. I recently published a new short story, the first part of a short story. I'm going to be publishing subsequent parts at 1 week intervals. And I've begun doing the same thing as well with my fiction. So I have a number of novels that I'm going to be publishing. One novel already available for sale, and I published the first chapter of that novel on my website, with others to come, again at 1 week intervals. This is done for a variety of reasons, but also just because I would like to get my work out there for anyone who's interested. I recognize that we're living in difficult times for a great many of us. These are not easy times so far as money is concerned, certainly, and I don't want my, even the purchase of say $15 or $20 book can in many cases be prohibitively high considering the economic disaster into which we're stumbling. And so I do want to give some ability to people to read my work should they be interested. And then this is my way of doing so in a way that's not, just publishing the entire thing at once, which I think would be kind of overwhelming and counterproductive. So rather, I'm going to give it in the old style of some of our great English novelists and also others, like Dostoevsky, who published these things. And what was the word? I can't even remember the word now. Speaking of language, this important word has escaped me. But they published their work in chapters, in periodicals. Thank you. Serial publication. There we are, Jared. Serial publication of their work. So in taking my inspiration from that, I'm doing the same thing on my website. And there's more to come. So again,
John, am I to understand, or did I miss something? I apologize. This is actually the first I'm hearing of this. This is exciting.
Yes, it's a novelty. It happened just today, as a matter of fact. I said it to.
Is this the Robin Hood?
The Robin Hood is going to be the next one that I begin, Jared. This is actually Thorn Tree, which is my presently available novel. The Robin Hood is going to be published in the same way, and I'm preparing that, so that should be within short order. I should be able to publish the first chapter of that as well.
Okay. As I wrap up, Jason, I'm seeing to check Cash App. You might want to check Cash App again. But yes,
I saw.
If you can support, I have John's novel Thorn Tree, his nonfiction New Prometheans. We wanted to ask him something about a very intriguing chapter title in the new Prometheans called Custom is the Ground of Law, I believe. And we didn't even get to that today. So a lot more to talk about. The new Prometheans is a very sweeping look at the last 500 years, how we ended up here, the different kinds of isms and ideologies that have led to the modern world. John's a serious dude. So
Touches a lot on language as well. There
Yeah.
are questions there about the use of our words and how words have been changed already at the beginning of modernity, and how that's had effects on the way that we comprehend things as fundamental as liberty and freedoms.
yeah, yeah. So always a lot to talk about. I'm seeing Based Guitarist. I like your name. I was talking with Ruination Media, our friend Lovely Parge, about guitars in the chat a minute ago. I noticed a lot of warmth from this community. I'm glad that you said that. That's not by accident. We love the people here, and even as we maintain, we try to, we go into different modes. And with John here, it's often going to be something that is, you're going to have to pay attention, and you might have to listen once, a couple more times. It could be intellectually challenging, but even when we
Per my vices as described earlier, but
even when we get into that kind of thing, we try to. Maybe we fail sometimes. You let us know. No one's perfect, but Jason and I really try to make it so that even when it's at its most intellectual, it's not off-putting. It's not some special club. We have all kinds of talks with all kinds of people, men and women from around the West, all kinds of interests, because we are all in this together. And the spirit behind the show I do with John here, Learning in Public, is that we say we're experts in nothing. We don't get up and say that we're pontificating on something. We're continually learning things and trying things. And that particular show gives us the space to kind of have these salon style conversations. If you're interested in that, you could go to my site. They're all cataloged there. We're currently setting them up on Spreaker as well, if it's easier for you to listen on podcast. I put a link in the chat a couple of minutes ago because, John, you mentioned language, and Jonas had asked about other languages. Of course, as English speakers, we can't speak as experts on other languages, but John is fluent in Italian, lives there. So as I said, there's a link that I put in the chat for anyone interested is on my site, where you can see that Learning in Public episode 19 from a few months ago was all about language. And then there's a couple of clips from there. But that tag of language on my site, there's also other shows like the After Party comes up with Tim Murdoch. So anything you want to see that had language, you could check out that link. And my site, as I said, thegreatorder.com, catalog of all I do. There's a poem in the new White People's Quarterly that's just been released. A poem of mine is in there. And there's also a review of the folk book, that project that I helped put together. And Jason, myself, and John, all three of the gentlemen on the screen, have pieces in that coffee table book. Mark your calendars. Jason and I, in a few Mondays, it's the 26th, I believe, going to be on Frodi's Decameron Film Festival, discussing an Italian film, The Great Beauty. I've seen it. Jason has not. We'll see what it brings up. I don't quite remember everything about it, but I know that it was very aesthetically interesting, very Fellini-esque movie that came out in 2013. If nothing else, if you want to watch it before we discuss it with Frodi, it has gorgeous, gorgeous photography of Rome and surrounding areas of Italy. I saw it in the theater and it was stunning visually. So lots of projects, greatorder.com. Follow all the social media, bookmark our websites, give Odyssey a try. Hopefully it'll stick around. But as we always say, we have control over our sites. So please bookmark our pages, get on the mailing lists. Of course, Jason and I, our shared site is theafterparty.tv, where these shows and the Going Frees are all cataloged, and sometimes other material as well. Like if we make clips from TAP, and then there's some older one-off videos and different things we've done. A lot of material there as well. So that is a little bit of a run of it. Jason, I know we had something on Cash App, I was told. I think that's it for now, but we'll all see you soon. Check out our sites and social media for announcements about the next shows. Love to you all. Have a great weekend. We'll speak soon.
And we do. And thank you so, both of you, so very much for this magnificent tap. We will be back. The conversation continues. And as Jared said, we make a serious effort to make this usable material, unlike you'll get elsewhere where you see a lot of doom dissecting, and it's nothing really there that you can use in your life, except for feeling like you've accomplished something over the several hours of listening and then actually have done nothing. But somebody who did do something was Psyche Invictus, gave a financial gift of $25 to purchase Go Free for the young girl that we were referencing earlier. And so that's more than just Go Free. We'll be able to get her several of the books for that investment. So thank you so very much for that. That's the warmth of this community, knowing that these materials will make a difference in her life. She'll end up being and what we just hope and pray in every single way, that she will grow up to be a magnificent woman, a glorious wife, a wonderful mother, and will bring great heroes, sons and daughters of the West, into the world. We look forward to all of that. Thank you all so much for being here, for your financial gifts, for your comments, for your conversation, for your love, for your community. It is all so very important to everything that we are doing here in service to white well-being, something that is truly revolutionary, paradigmatic change. I want to thank Roy, who was in the chat moderating. Thank you so much for that. Maybe Lovely Porch did some moderating as well. I don't know, but we'll thank him anyhow, just in case. And a final big thank you again to everybody who financially gifted. It is in the day and age that we live in where dollars have beaten religion a long time ago. It is the gas that makes the motor run. And I'm afraid there's no way out of that fact. So we thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you all again.